By 1930, the national economy began to disintegrate. As the Depression worsened, a 10% wage cut was imposed upon employees. Then began a period of labor unrest, which erupted into a strike in 1934. The strike quickly turned violent. There was rioting in Milwaukee. During this time, the federal government was pressuring for separation of utility operations from transit operations by TMER&L and similar companies. By then, the East Troy line was down to only 4 departures and 4 arrivals each day. The Burlington line was in even worse condition. Both routes were now losing heavily. There was nothing else to be done. TMER&L would get out of the interurban business. On May 2nd, 1938, the Burlington line to St. Martin's was abandoned. The East Troy line would hold out a little longer. As the rails to Burlington were being removed, a petition was filed with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission seeking to abandon the line between East Troy and Hales Corners. However, the residents and industries of East Troy took the defensive, not necessarily to preserve passenger service, but to protect the village's increased freight interests. Remember that several industries had settled along the line because of railway service. East Troy wasn't about to lose them. The village had just weathered the Great Depression and a major economic recession the year before. In June 1938, abandonment hearings were set at the Waukesha County Courthouse. East Troy citizens rallied to the scene to speak out in favor of saving the line. Historians have often noted the irony of how the protesters traveled to Waukesha that day to save the railway. They organized an automobile caravan, completely ignoring the line that they were trying to protect. At any rate, all that was resolved was that the company offered to sell the line to the industries involved. It appears now that the company may have known the commission would never allow full abandonment because of the village's situation. East Troy began to consider buying the line itself. Everyone waited. The next hearing was a year later, on June 17th, 1939, in East Troy. The company repeated its desire to sell the line. 10 days later, on June 27th, a village referendum approved purchase by the municipality for a price of $10,000. The vote was 377 in favor, 14 opposed. Bonds were authorized for the purchase. The tax rate, which was already up because of a new high school, was raised again. But the line to McWanago was saved, or it joined the Sioux line. Total distance, 7.2 miles. Now the realization set in that passenger service was indeed ending to East Troy and McWanago. The company agreed to lease back the railway from the village and operate freight service for 10 years. The rent was set at $400 a year. That was even less than the company had paid in property taxes to the village. On August 13th, 1939, all passenger service ended. The interurban line between McWanago and Hales Corners was abandoned, and the village of East Troy found itself in the trolley business. In the next decade, freight shipments did increase, but elsewhere, TMER&L was abandoning its other interurban lines. By 1949, they were nearly all gone. That's the year the company's lease expired and the village itself then began operating the railway. Also about this time, the village began to find itself being approached by people with plans to restore passenger service on the route. Another discovery was that people with cameras were beginning to turn up along the line, perhaps because trolley lines were by now vanishing everywhere in America. What had been taken for granted was now becoming appreciated and sought after. One gradual change since the village took ownership was that the rail bed was slowly deteriorating to the point where speeds had to be reduced a little more each year. The cost of rebuilding was impossible for the village to bear. As it was, the trolley line was operating at a deficit, which had to be made up by the village treasury. Clearly, something had to be done, and in early 1970, something was done that was good news for the village economy, but was also, in one way, potentially worrisome for the growing legion of roadside admirers that were visiting the railway in increasing numbers each year. What was happening was this. The Trent Tube Works was a major freight shipper and built a lengthy spur line to their new plant. That was the good news.
Trent Tube built the spur mainly to reduce our shipping costs of our product out of this plant. In the past, we've always had to ship by truck, and using rail, we can reduce our shipping costs by as much as 50%.
What, in your judgment, will the building of this spur mean to the community of East Troy?
Well, for one thing, as you know, East Troy owns its own electric railroad, and it's been running at a deficit for several years now. We'll put out about 200 cars a year out of our plant here, and it'll certainly help them in that respect. Also, the spur comes through the town's new industrial park, and the town has property adjacent to the spur that they will be selling to other industries.
So you're looking on this as the beginning of growth for not only your company, but for the area?
Absolutely. As you know, our new plant is also on the spur, which will mean an additional 50 or 60 jobs to our community.
The driving of the stainless steel spike was nothing compared with the driving of the golden spike in Utah 100 years ago, but it means a great deal to the community of East Troy. It means life for the electric railroad that runs through here, and it's another sign of the continued economic growth of the areas outside Milwaukee. Ed Hinshaw, News 4, reporting from East Troy.
If that was the good news, the worry came when Trent Tube would not bear the cost of installing trolley wire on this stretch of new railway, so the village had to buy a small diesel locomotive for this segment. Eventually, it took over all freight operations. For a while, there were fears that the overhead wire would be removed forever. But before the trolley wire became redundant, the first passenger trolley in 33 years rolled once again on Memorial Day, 1972. This time it was staffed by volunteers who enjoyed the sights and sounds of trolley operation to such a degree that hundreds came to work on the line for no wages at all, not even travel expenses. Revenues from fares could then be funneled back into maintenance and restoration. Still, though, the ongoing deterioration of the 70-year-old rail bed was worrisome. In many places, the ties had rotted completely away from the rail. Despite everything, lack of funds for the track was again raising the threat of abandonment.